But to get to the moon, many different sectors were required. This was not just about aeronautics. You needed innovation in nutrition, in textiles, in many different sectors. There was about 300 projects that got us to the moon, of which most of them failed. So the willingness to experiment, explore, to welcome uncertainty. We shouldn't forget that risk and uncertainty are two different things. But again, what could be different moonshots around not just renewable energy, but sustainable cities? Again, getting the plastic out. And I think this is a really important question in a forum like this. But the next point is that's almost impossible to do if on the home base, on the ground in different nations and cities, we don't have what's called innovation systems. And there's lots to learn from what was happening in the 1980s in Japan and the Soviet Union. You had the Soviet Union that was actually spending a lot of money on innovation. So their R&D to GDP ratio was one of the highest in the world, but they actually didn't achieve innovation-led growth. Japan had less R&D to GDP. It was still high, but not as much as the Soviet Union, but they had strong systems of innovation. So these dynamic horizontal linkages between science and industry, patient long-term capital. We sometimes forget that, as nice and sexy as venture capital might be, the fact that it's so exit-driven, they want to exit in 3 years through an IPO or a buyout, that didn't actually help us get, the nanotech, the biotech, the internet revolution. VC was very able to come in after a lot of different types of patient finance. So when you actually look on the ground at places like Germany, where they have patient finance, they have the Fraunhofer Institutes, these dynamic science industry linkages, very strong vocational programs and apprenticeships. I think there's been a lost opportunity in Europe, for example, to really learn from those lessons. We always talk about the core and the periphery, right? So Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, the periphery, some of the more northern European countries as the core, but we didn't ask, what do they have? How could we actually learn from, how the KfW, the patient bank, works in Germany? What might be the lessons for a country like Italy, which does have a patient bank through the Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, but it's not really been about cooperation, but just handouts, right?
Mariana, there is also the role played by public finance of that deep research, which requires timing.
That's the point, right? You have both public and private finance, but the ability for public, patient, long-term, committed finance to often lead the way, but in a particular way. When it's just handouts to sectors, the businesses that shout out the most, give me finance, that doesn't necessarily work. When it is about transformation, then it works, where you're actually picking the willing, not picking the winners. Anyway, there's lots of really interesting, I think, lessons we can learn about when innovation systems have been strongest. And I do think today in Europe, where there's so much instability again in terms of the European project, how to really think about the European region as a place that could also learn what works, what doesn't. And in the African continent, of course, where there is the African Development Bank, we also have the Asian Development Bank, we have the Chinese Development Bank. It's not just about public finance, it's the structure of these public organizations. And the more that they can really catalyze new forms of public-private partnerships, but also lead the way in the high-risk, capital-intensive areas, which then crowd in private entrepreneurship, I think that's key, and that doesn't always happen. And the problem is, if we just think of public versus private, austerity versus infrastructure spending, it doesn't actually help us get the more granular understanding of what innovation systems require.
Terrific. So if you had, we'll come to the policy section a bit later on, but if you had a research and development tax credit system, you would make it very, very granular, and you would actually pick the willing rather than the winners and not spread around.
Well, evidence is useful, and R&D tax credits, as well as other types of tax credits for innovation, tend to only work when they're icing on the cake. Yeah. So that's basically an indirect mechanism through which you can, if you want, help businesses innovate. But businesses invest when their expectations about future growth opportunities are high. So the real question is, what do we know about the kind of smart policies that have actually increased those expectations? And it tends to have been through direct investment in bold, new, ambitious areas. And definitely the climate area is a very important one.